In this video, I will examine in depth the issues which are connected to one of the most strategic choke points of the global maritime areas, which is the Malacca Strait. And my ambition with this long case study will be to provide you with examples on almost all of the issues that we can develop when talking about maritime areas. From the economic importance to geopolitical issues or environmental ones, for example. So on this picture you can see how dense is the traffic in the strait. The picture was taken south of the city of Singapore. You can see the skyline of Singapore in the backgrounds, and you can see that the intensity of the maritime traffic here leads to almost a congestion. And by the way, you may realize that many of these boats that we see here are tankers, so they transport oil. The location of the Strait of Malacca is in Southeast Asia. As you can see on the map, it's a region which is a bit complex regarding its the landform geography. The Strait of Malacca is south of the peninsula that starts in Thailand and then consists of Malaysia and eventually the city of Singapore at the southern tip of the peninsula. And it's also north of the archipelago of Indonesia. So you have already a complex natural geography. And what makes the strait particularly strategic is that it is the gateway to East Asia, if you come from Europe, from the Middle East or from India. And for East Asia, so mostly China and Japan, it is an important choke point for imports and exports as well. Imports of oil for the Middle East, exports of manufactured goods in all the areas west of East Asia, that is to say everything but the Americas, in fact. This is a screenshot from the website Maritime Traffic, which shows quite clearly how dense is the traffic here and around the strait. So you can see a bit better the landform around Singapore. And well, how long is the strait as well? It's long by a couple of hundreds of kilometers along the island of Sumatra and the peninsula of Malaysia, which I think it's more than a day to cross the strait. And so, as I mentioned a bit earlier already, so it's a key choke point for several types of traffic and trades. The port of Singapore is really highlighted on this map. You can see how big is the circle, the blue circle of the port of Singapore, which has become for the last 40 years one of the very busiest ports in the world. But in fact, if you look again at the numerous major ports of the coast of China, you can understand how much the strait is important for them as well. In fact, one of the very important material which is being transported via the Strait of Malacca is oil, crude oil coming from the Middle East. Statistics tells that more than 90% of the crude oil which is imported by East Asia crosses the Malacca Strait. In fact, the port of Singapore, as we'll see later, has a kind of expertise and special development of the industry of oil refining, which means that Singapore has developed itself as a hub for the trade of oil in East Asia. The needs in oil in East Asia are very, very huge due to the very high population and the economic growth, and the lack of natural resource in oil in most of East Asia. From a more general point of view, 1/3 of global merchant traffic crosses the Strait every year. It includes raw materials that are needed by China, like coal or iron, coming from India, for example, and also on the other side, the exports of East Asia to Europe, South Asia, Middle East, and even Africa across the strait as well. In a way, we could say that the big power for which the Strait of Malacca is of lesser importance will probably be the United States. And that is interesting because, in fact, the United States is far from being absent from the Strait of Malacca, as we will see later. This is a rather old map from a French textbook, so obviously all the figures that are given here they might be out of date. What I like on this map is the fact that the color scheme of shades of green shows us various indices of human development. So the HDI of Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And what is interesting is to realize that we are also at a strategic spot of the geography of development, because with Singapore you have an HIC, a high-income country, and that's a high-income country of a very specific kind, because Singapore is just a city-state. So it's both a state and a city. And then you have two NICs, but of various levels of development. If you remember, so many countries of the world can be considered to be newly industrialized countries. So the transitory development situation between low development and high development. But Malaysia is more advanced. Malaysia's standards of living are significantly higher than those of Indonesia, and we are in a very densely populated area of the world, in particular in Indonesia, where the demographic pressure is very high. So these contrast in human development are a factor of another kind of flow, which will be migrant flows. Due to the demographic pressure, the search for employment, etc. So that is another interesting element in the geography of the Strait of Malacca, which also happens to be, and that is one last point we can make with this map, a beautiful place. So tourism exists in the area, and in particular tourism has recently taken off for the city of Singapore. Both I would say leisure tourism, but most importantly business tourism, as if Singapore had become a kind of hub for the businessmen of the world. And so I think it's interesting to do a focus on the city-state of Singapore, because we can really say that what some people would call the economic miracle of Singapore, which is far from being a miracle, actually it's really logical, was based on the exploitation of this asset, which is this great location near the Strait of Malacca. Clearly, the Strait has been a source of major economic development for Singapore, making it one of the most attractive areas of the global economy. those who in the past had understood how great would the importance of Singapore be were the British, because in fact the port of Singapore was developed by the British in the 19th century as a colony that, by the way, the British called the Strait colonies. So they really insisted on the importance of the Strait, even in the name of the colony they had created there. And so because they already had some trading posts in China, notably with Hong Kong, well, having this step on the road to China, Singapore, strategic port, was seen as important for the British. In the 1960s, the city of Singapore became an independent state, and it knew an economic boom as one of the 4 Asian tigers, the 3 other ones being Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea. A few words about the Asian tigers is something important. So these 4 little states were the first NICs of history, in a way. In the middle of the Cold War, so the opposition and conflict between the capitalist countries led by the USA and the communist ones led by the USSR and China, these 4 Asian tigers developed a model of mixed economy with a very business-friendly environment. In fact, they were the first special economic zones of the modern era. They had very low taxations, low labor regulations, and they used an export-led form of development, specializing in some specific trades. First of all, textile, and later the electronics. When I was a child in the 80s and 90s, almost all of the electronics were either made in Taiwan or made in South Korea, for example. And I said mixed economy because, like in most Asian states, in fact, the role of the state in managing economy was strong and still is. Notably with massive investments in infrastructure and education, which is again a pattern that we could also find in South Korea or Taiwan, for example. And last but not least, the other reason why the Asian tigers were so successful from the 60s to the 90s and all reached the level of HIC in the end is that it was the context of the Cold War, and they were aided by the USA and Japan in their success, notably because the USA accepted to import the products from the Asian tigers at the expense of American products. But what mattered for the US government was that these little capitalist countries in Asia, which was dominated by communism in those days, they had to succeed. It was a way to prove that capitalism was better than communism. And so that's the story of a place like Singapore, which really became, after 3 decades, one of the symbols of the success of capitalism. And this success is made clearly visible by the glorious skyline of the Singapore CBD that you can see here on this picture, with those numerous skyscrapers, and in particular the famous hotel made out of 3 skyscrapers connected in their top by a large swimming pool, which has become really the monument symbolic of Singapore's success. And that's a monument which is only about luxury and business and leisure, actually. So it's very symbolic of this aspect of modern times. And this is what Singapore looks like on a map. So it's in itself an archipelago, except that there is one island which is much larger than the others. At the south of this triangular island, you have the CBD of Singapore, and along the coastline, in fact, almost 1/3 of the the surface of Singapore is made of reclaimed land. So land that has been man-made, that has been built on the seas in order to enlarge the city of Singapore where needed. And so these enlargements are in the east the Changi airport, and in Changi you also have a military base for the navies. Some islands to the south of the CBD, notably the Sentosa Island, which I will say something about in a few minutes, and the west of the island of Singapore and the archipelago has mostly been developed as a port and an industrial estate as well in the area known as Jurong. This is the maritime traffic, again a screenshot from maritime traffic website. You can see here a diversity of boats, but great presence of tankers in red. Tankers are in red, so for oil and merchant ships are in green. The reason why tankers are so numerous is because there is some oil resources underseas, so you have some offshore exploitation, notably to the east of Singapore and the Malaysian Peninsula. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, in Jurong, the area is covered in oil refineries because Singapore has developed a specialty in refining oil from the Middle East and re-exporting it in all South Asia, including China, and in East Asia, Japan. So we can say that what made the success of Singapore from the economic point of view is its determination to becoming the hub of Southeast Asia, the place which connects Southeast Asia to the rest of the world, and in fact, more generally than that, the hub, the big hub between India and China. The fact that it is a city-state makes it one of the richest states in the world in GDP per capita. It's really a core of the global economy. Nowadays, what Singapore has managed to do very successfully was to diversify its economy. It's not only an economy based on oil refining or distribution of textile industry at all. It's a city for business. It's a city which is definitely business friendly. It's a tax haven, one of the lowest taxation level on on companies and on the benefits they can make. There is a reason why tax havens are often very small places. It's because you can be a tax haven when you are a very small state, because the public investments that are needed are not that big. I mean, not as big as on a very large territory, very populated territory. And so even the small percentage of taxation which is being taken is enough to permit these public services, development of infrastructure, etc. Is Singapore an industrial center today? Not as much as in the past. I think we can clearly say that Singapore has become more than an NIC now. It's an HIC clearly, and most of the production is being made in the neighboring areas where labor is cheaper in the factories in Malaysia and in Indonesia, but many exports are done from the port of Singapore, which has a big activity of transshipment, consequently. And the reason why I like this picture is because you really have on three grounds, in the foreground, the middle distance, and the backgrounds, three activities of modern Singapore today. So in the foreground, you can see a golf club on the island of Sentosa. And from a more general point of view, the island of Sentosa seems to be dedicated to leisure. You also have a Disneyland theme park and many hotels. And so this golf course. So we can imagine this man to be a businessman from the USA or Europe, having some fun in between some business talks in one of the numerous skyscrapers of the CBD. So the financial activities of Singapore have developed a lot as part of this diversification. And really, since the year 2000, Singapore has become a very famous tourist attraction, notably since they have made gambling legal, a bit like in Las Vegas. So same places, but now seen from above. So in the south you see the golf course. In the middle distance, the containers of one of the numerous ports of Singapore. And in the background, but we can't see it there, we could see the CBD. So different activities located at the same point on the map. That is a very impressive economic place, Singapore, really. And so yes, I mentioned that a few minutes ago. So here are other pictures of the now very famous Marina Bay Sands Resort, which is a luxury hotel where you have these three skyscrapers, and on top of it a pool that they have nicknamed the Infinity Pool. So that's an example of the luxury tourism that has also developed in Singapore. One illustration of the population of Singapore and what it's like. So it's now a city populated by 5.7 million. The city claims to be a multicultural city because, well, the citizens of Singapore are a mixture of Chinese, Malay, and Indian origins, and which result notably in a great religious diversity. What is interesting is that it's a state where only 2/3 of the population was born there. You only have 3.5 Singapore citizens, 3.5 million, and the last third is composed of foreign-born people, with a distinction between the permanent residents, which are 500,000, those who can stay on a permanent basis, and the non-residents, 1.6 million, which are, if we say it another way, temporary migrant workers. And there will be a lot to say about them. So, what I would like you to remember about the success of Singapore is that it's really a model of development based on the fact of being a hub, and so of being a very strategic place of the global economy. But by definition, it is a model of development that can be applied to a larger country. It is really strongly linked with the fact of being just a city-state. Now, it does not mean that the rest of the area does not benefit from the Strait as well. For sure, Malaysia and Indonesia also enjoy being neighboring countries of the Strait. And even though for a long time Singapore has in a way monopolized the economic success of the peninsula and the Strait by being more advanced in its port facilities, harbor facilities, we can yet say that Malaysia and Indonesia have benefited from some trickle-down effect from the success of Singapore. Indeed, the manufacturing sector developed in Malaysia and Indonesia, notably thanks to capital coming from Singapore. The idea is always the same, manufacturing workforce being cheaper in Indonesia and Malaysia. Companies have exploited the new international division of labor then, mostly in Malaysia and secondly in Indonesia. And nowadays, there is also a growing competition between the harbors of the area, notably again Malaysia coming first with a couple of harbors along the coastline of the Strait of Malacca. And you can see some examples of them on this map. Two ports specialized in container traffic, like the one of Kelang in the north of this map, which is in fact the port of the capital city of Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and the port of Tanjung Pelapas, which is situated just next to Singapore. In fact, if we look at this satellite view, you can see on the left some facilities, some docklands from the port of Tanjung Pelapas in Malaysia, and east of the border you can see the Jurong harbor, which is being enlarged at the moment. You can see new wharves being built on the tip of the peninsula called Tuas. So an idea of competition between the ports of the Strait, which try to be as competitive as possible in order to attract traffic. Okay, now I will examine some of the downside effects of the success of the Strait with a certain diversity of topics. So first of all, even if it's not strongly connected to maritime issues, I would like to say a few words about the Singaporean model, which is sometimes praised as being the example of how great globalization can be for the development of some places, which is true. Clearly, we can say that Singapore's success is a skillful management of globalization based on their asset of being a hub. Now, there are some downsides to it. In fact, in Singapore, the idea I would like you to remember is that the country is ruled like a company would be, which implies that it's in fact very authoritarian. In theory, it should be a democracy because you have elections, but in practice there is a strong media control by the leading political party, which is called the People's Action Party. And this party has totally dominated Singaporean politics since the 1960s, with the first leader of this party, first Prime Minister of Singapore. He's been Prime Minister for 30 years, I think, from the 60s to the 90s, Lee Kuan Yew. This party has not been defeated in the election since the creation of the city-state. And, the standards of living are really high in Singapore. It does not mean it's heaven for everybody. Well, first point, it is a very, very densely populated place. And so collective housing is the norm. Tower blocks are really covering the entire urban area of Singapore, which is a characteristic that most of even the middle class in Singapore lives in very small places. And the situation of the more than 1 million foreign workers is particularly difficult. So, which is the same in most of the big cities of the world. The big cities of the world are places of wealth, but there are always, at the same time, places of great social and economic inequalities. Because you always need some low-paid jobs to do the dirty, dangerous jobs. And in Singapore, these foreign workers come from the demographic giants of South Asia, like India or Bangladesh. There is such a demographic pressure in these countries that emigration can be a solution for people. But in Singapore, so they welcome a lot of migrant workers, notably to work in the construction business or to work at the domestic level in low-paid services. The migrants are almost only men in the construction business, almost only women in hotels and all the rest. But in both cases, they enjoy only a temporary stay, and they are not allowed to bring their family. They mostly live in dormitories, and their difficult living conditions are constant. In fact, we could clearly say that Singapore, like many other cities, is exploiting the poverty of other places of the world with this immigration for work. But the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed their social misery, as the lockdown for them was a lockdown in dormitories imposed in a very authoritarian way by the Singaporean authorities. And in fact, there is a statistic that is really impressive, which says that 95% of all COVID cases in Singapore concerned migrant workers. So I don't know how accurate can this figure be, but it illustrates, among other examples, how difficult is life for the poor in the richest cities of the world, like Singapore, where the cost of living is very high. In Singapore, it is the highest cost of living in Asia, notably for housing. Now, if we go back to the Strait itself, some of the downsides is security. Due to massive traffic, there is, well, first of all, the daily pollution, which is high, and a high risk of accidents. I chose to illustrate that one of the famous accidents of the recent times, which was in 2017 when a US warship collided with an oil tanker. So because it was a US ship, it made the news, but what is perhaps more interesting is that many accidents in the Strait involve oil tankers. So as a result, there is a risk of oil spill and so of major environmental impact. Accidents can also involve illegal migrant ships, which are very frequent in the Strait, obviously. And here we can refer again to the development inequalities that exist in the region. For many people who economically have very low opportunities, migration to Singapore or to Malaysia is something tempting. But as you can see on this newspaper title, restrictions on migrant flows, on illegal migration, are very, very, very high in this area, a bit like in the Mediterranean. And so a bit like in the Mediterranean, there is a rather high mortality of migrants who try to cross the Strait on a very precarious ship, and of course are facing huge dangers due to traffics. Another famous danger for security in the Strait is piracy. So for For several factors, the Malacca Strait is one of the important areas of modern piracy in the world. 1/3 of all acts of piracy are registered in the Malacca Strait. So it's mostly robberies, notably of oil tankers, because you have very small pirate boats who try to steal some oil from the tankers, and they can easily sell it on the black market later, because the demand in oil is so high. Piracy is very irregular. Maybe it's registration which is irregular, but in 2015, which obviously was a peak in the piracy acts, there were more than 1,000 acts. 3 years later, in 2018, only 8 piracy acts were registered, and again in 2019 it was 30 piracy acts. Why is piracy so important and logical in the Strait is the natural factors, the fact that it's an archipelago in Indonesia, and so that is a terrain that is difficult to control. It's easy to hide, basically, for the pirates, and state control in Indonesia is made difficult because the government is not very rich. So despite some cooperation with the neighboring states, notably of Malaysia and of the Philippines, it's difficult to control piracy. And again, these economic inequalities and the massive poverty that exists in Indonesia is another factor that favors illegal activities. In a way, we could say that pirates are trying to take a grip on a small percentage of these huge amount of commodities that pass through the Strait every day. So in fact, any core area of the global economy is attractive to all forms of trade, including the illegal ones like this. And so because security is really an issue, we can talk about the geopolitical aspects of life in the Malacca Strait. There is clearly a risk of conflict around the Malacca Strait, which is illustrated by the presence of the navies of several states, which try to maintain order in the strait in order to keep traffic high and fluent. Alongside the naval forces of the neighboring countries, Malaysia, Singapore, you have some world-level naval powers which are present in the area. So on the screen now you have two pictures, one of the Changi naval base in the southeast of Singapore, where some boats of the Singapore Navy are landed, but also boats from the US Navy and the Royal Navy of Britain. In fact, there are some treaties that connect this small state Singapore to big Western powers as a kind of legacy of the Cold War. And so it's the big powers of Britain and the USA that try to keep an eye and protect the Western interest here. In fact, what you must understand is that even though we are in Southeast Asia, Europe and even the USA to a certain extent have interest in this zone, because their trade, their access to the commodities they need could be damaged if there was a problem in the Strait of Malacca, even though it's on the other side of the world. So for security, cooperation between the neighboring countries and the great power is important. In theory, neighboring countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia are in charge of security. but the aid of great powers is necessary, notably in funding and training. And Japan is also a huge funder of security in the Strait. But the growing power in this part of the world is, of course, China. And China pays great attention to this area because it really considers the Strait of Malacca as its lifeline, notably for oil and exports. So what China fears the most is the blockade of the Strait one day. China would be the economy that would suffer the most from a problem in the Malacca Strait. This is the reason why the Chinese naval presence is growing in these seas. And so you can see here a picture of a patrol of the Chinese Navy. And in fact, if we look at this on a map, you can see the presence of, so near Singapore and in the rest of the region, some US military bases. We have already evoked them. But there is also a growing presence of Chinese military bases. And so there is an expression that is being used to illustrate the creation of numerous Chinese ports, Chinese-funded ports in Southeast Asia. It's called the Pearl Necklace Strategy. In fact, this expression of the Pearl Necklace Strategy is mostly used by one of the enemies of China, or rivals maybe would be better than enemies, which is India. India is afraid of being surrounded by the pearl necklace created by China. China has been funding naval facilities in many neighbors of India, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, in Bangladesh. So it fears to be encircled, and so in order to counterbalance this growing influence, India is in its turn building some naval bases, notably in the islands of Andaman and Nicobar, which are posed for the Indian Navy to also have a control on here the northern entry of the Strait of Malacca. On its side, China also has another project which is very interesting for the Strait, the project of building a canal, so not in China of course, but in Thailand. It is a project known as the Kra Canal, and if this canal is done, honestly I don't know how advanced the project is, but that would create a great competition for the Malacca Strait and its neighboring countries, and in particular Singapore. This is part of the Chinese strategy to make everything possible to multiply the maritime routes that can permit its economic development based on globalization to carry on. But Malaysia, Singapore, or Indonesia are worried about this growth of Chinese presence in the region and the competition of the Kra Canal in the future. And so you can see how, logically, with economic success in the Strait of Malacca, you also have all the downsides of economic success when the stakes become high, pressure on the environment, pressure on security, pressure on international relations. We are really at the center of all the issues of this lesson about maritime areas and their geopolitical importance.